MMT, Sectoral Balances, and Behavior by L. Randall Wray. In blog number 2, we introduced the basics of macro accounting, and in blog number 3, we took a break from accounting to take a look at the rise and fall of the Goldilocks economy in the U.S. Thus, we applied our sectoral balance identity to the case of the United States. In today's blog, we will go a bit deeper into the accounting, looking at the relation between flows, deficits, and stocks, debts. To avoid making mistakes, we need to make sure that we have consistency between our flows and our stocks. We want to make sure that all spending and saving comes from somewhere and goes somewhere. And we must make sure that one sector's surplus is offset by a deficit in another sector. This is a lot like keeping track of scores in a baseball game. And in fact, most financial scores really are electronic entries in the modern world. We will also try to say something about causation. It is not sufficient to say that at the aggregate level, the private balance plus the government balance plus the foreign balance equals 0. We would like to be able to understand why the private sector balance was negative during the Clinton Goldilocks years, while the government balance was positive. How did we get to that point, and what sorts of processes did it induce? Obviously, that is necessary before we can really analyze the situation and formulate policy. Unlike the macro accounting identity, which must be true, it is not possible to say with certainty what causes a particular sector's balance. It is quite easy to say that if the government runs a surplus and if the foreign balance is positive, foreign sector spending less than its income, then the domestic private sector must by accounting identity be negative, running a deficit. It all must sum to 0. Explaining why the private sector had a deficit during the Goldilocks years is harder. It is even harder to project if and for how long that deficit would continue. I already made clear in blog 3 that I got the timing wrong. Private sector deficits continued for about 4 years longer than I expected. Projections are darn hard to get right. If they were easy, MMTers would all make lots of money placing bets on outcomes. Another way of stating this is to say that a good understanding of MMT does not give one any monopoly on explanations of causation. We must not be overly confident. As the late and great Wynne Godley used to put it, he did not make forecasts, rather, he made contingent projections. For example, carrying on with the work of Godley, the Levy Economics Institute makes such projections. Typically, it begins with CBO, Congressional Budget Office projections of the path of government deficits and of economic growth over the next few years. CBO projections are largely determined by current law, for example, laws determining government spending and taxing, as well as mandates over deficit reduction. However, the CBO's projections are not stock flow consistent and do not adopt the 3-sector balances approach. This used to drive Godley crazy. In other words, they are incoherent. But given projections over the government balance and GDP growth, as well as empirical estimates of various economic parameters, propensity to consume and import, for example, one can produce a stock flow consistent model that produces the implied sectoral balances as well as path of debt. The Levy Institute often finds that economic growth rates, for example, plus government deficit projections used in CBO forecasts imply highly implausible balances in the other 2 sectors, domestic private and foreign, as well as private debt ratios. To do that kind of analysis, you must go beyond the simple accounting identities. Deficits lead to savings, and debts lead to wealth. We have established in our previous blogs that the deficits of one sector must equal the surpluses of at least one of the other sectors. We have also established that the debts of one sector must equal the financial wealth of at least one of the other sectors. So far, this all follows from the principles of macro accounting. However, the economist wishes to say more than this, for like all scientists, economists are interested in causation. Economics is a social science, that is, the science of extraordinarily complex social systems in which causation is never simple because economic phenomena are subject to interdependence, hysteresis, cumulative causation, and so on. Still, we can say something about causal relationships among the flows and stocks that have been discussing in the previous blogs. Some readers will note that the causal connections adopted here follow from Keynesian theory. Number 1. Individual spending is mostly determined by income. Our starting point will be the private sector decision to spend. For the individual, it seems plausible to argue that income largely determines spending because one with no income is certainly going to be severely constrained when deciding to purchase goods and services. However, on reflection, it is apparent that even at the individual level, the link between income and spending is loose. One can spend less than one's income accumulating net financial assets, or one can spend more than one's income by issuing financial liabilities, and thereby becoming indebted. Still, at the level of the individual household or firm, the direction of causation largely runs from income to spending, even if the correspondence between the two flows is not perfect. There is little reason to believe that one's own spending significantly determines one's own income. Number 2. Deficits create financial wealth. We can also say something about the direction of causation regarding accumulation of financial wealth at the level of the individual. If a household or firm decides to spend more than its income, running a budget deficit, it can issue liabilities to finance purchases. These liabilities will be accumulated as net financial wealth by another household, firm, or government that is saving, running a budget surplus. Of course, for this net financial wealth accumulation to take place, we must have one household or firm willing to deficit spend, and another household, firm, or government willing to accumulate wealth in the form of the liabilities of that deficit spender. We can say that it takes two to tango. However, it is the decision to deficit spend that is the initiating cause of the creation of net financial wealth. No matter how much others might want to accumulate financial wealth, they will not be able to do so unless someone is willing to deficit spend. Still, it is true that the household or firm will not be able to deficit spend unless it can sell accumulated assets or find someone willing to hold its liabilities. We can suppose there is a propensity or desire to accumulate net financial wealth. This does not mean that every individual firm or household will be able to issue debt so that it can deficit spend, but it does ensure that many firms and households will find willing holders of their debt. And in the case of a sovereign government, there is a special power, the ability to tax, that virtually guarantees that households and firms will want to accumulate the government's debt. That is a topic we pursue later. We conclude that while causation is complex, and while it takes two to tango, causation tends to run from individual deficit spending to accumulation of financial wealth, and from debt to financial wealth. Since accumulation of a stock of financial wealth results from a budget surplus, that is, from a flow of saving, we can also conclude that causation tends to run from deficit spending to saving. Number 3. Aggregate spending creates aggregate income. At the aggregate level, taking the economy as a whole, causation is more clear-cut. A society cannot decide to have more income, but it can decide to spend more. Further, all spending must be received by someone, somewhere, as income. Finally, as discussed earlier, spending is not necessarily constrained by income because it is possible for households, firms, or government to spend more than income. Indeed, as we discussed, any of the three main sectors can run a deficit with at least one of the others running a surplus. However, it is not possible for spending at the aggregate level to be different from aggregate income, since the sum of the sectoral balances must be 0. For all of these reasons, we must reverse causation between spending and income when we turn to the aggregate. While at the individual level, income causes spending, at the aggregate level, spending causes income. Number 4. Deficits in one sector create the surpluses of another. Earlier we showed that the deficits of one sector are by identity equal to the sum of the surplus balances of the other sectors. If we divide the economy into three sectors, domestic private sector, domestic government sector, and foreign sector, then if one sector runs a deficit, at least one other must run a surplus. Just as in the case of our analysis of individual balances, it takes two to tango, in the sense that one sector cannot run about a deficit if no other sector will run a surplus. Equivalently, we can say that one sector cannot issue debt if no other sector is willing to accumulate the debt instruments. Of course, much of the debt issued within a sector will be held by others in the same sector. For example, if we look at the finances of the private domestic sector, we will find that most business debt is held by domestic firms and households. In the terminology we introduced later, this is inside debt of those firms and households that run budget deficits held as inside wealth by those households and firms that run budget surpluses. However, if the domestic private sector taken as a whole spends more than its income, it must issue outside debt held as outside wealth by at least one of the other two sectors, domestic government sector and foreign sector. Because the initiating cause of a budget deficit is a desire to spend more than income, the causation mostly goes from deficits to surpluses and from debt to net financial wealth. While we recognize that no sector can run a deficit unless another wants to run a surplus, this is not usually a problem because there is a propensity to net save financial assets. That is to say, there is a desire to accumulate financial wealth, which by definition is somebody's liability. Conclusion. Before moving on, it is necessary to emphasize that everything in this blog, as well as blog number 2, applies to the macro accounting of any country. While examples use the dollar, all of the results apply no matter what currency is used. Our fundamental macro balance equation, domestic private sector plus domestic government balance. Once again, domestic private balance plus domestic government balance plus foreign balance equals 0 will strictly apply to the accounting of balances of any currency. Within a country, there can also be flows accumulating to stocks in a foreign currency, and there will be a macro balance equation in that currency too. Note that nothing changes if we expand our model to include a number of different countries, each of which issues its own currency. There will be a macro balance equation for each of those countries and for each of the currencies. Individual firms or households, or for that matter, governments, can accumulate net financial assets denominated in several different currencies. Vice versa, individual firms or households or governments can issue net debt denominated in several different currencies. It can even become more complicated, with an individual running a deficit in one currency and a surplus in another, issuing debt in one currency and accumulating wealth in another. Still, for every country and for every currency, there will be a macro balance equation. Okay, that is enough for this week. Can I remind commentators and questioners that this is a primer? We will collect questions and comments until Wednesday and then post a response. We appreciate comments and questions directly related to this blog. We really do not want comments from those who have already examined and reject MMT.